Hello. So the big news this week is that the S&P 500 closed above 5,000 for the first time ever in history. What does that mean? Well, the S&P 500 is an index made up of 500 of the biggest companies in the United States. And 5,000 is the highest that it has ever been valued at. So why is that significant? Well, it's a milestone that is symbolic. It's like turning 30. Realistically, turning 30 is not that different than being 29 or being 20 or being 31, right? Turning 30 is not that different than turning 29 or 31, but because it's a nice round number, because it's a milestone, it feels significant because it's the first time we've ever crossed this threshold. Well, that is the significance of the S&P 500 closing above 5,000 for the first time. And it's not just the S&P 500, it's also the Nasdaq and the Dow Jones that are hitting record highs. So the S&P 500 in particular has been in the news a lot lately because it had 6 consecutive days of record highs, and it's closing now on 5 weeks of new highs. And to see that, especially over such a broad index, is pretty significant. The reason for that is because this has been a market rally that's been led by a very, very narrow group of stocks, predominantly tech stocks. Now, tech stocks are highly represented in the NASDAQ, which is why it's no surprise that the NASDAQ keeps closing out at new highs. And large cap companies, meaning the biggest companies, are widely represented in the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones represents 30 companies versus the S&P 500, which represents 500 companies and 503 stocks, right? So when we see the Dow Jones hitting new highs, that's great. But what it tells us is that big companies, like, a basket of 30 very large companies, are doing well. When we see that the NASDAQ hits new highs, that's great too. But what we know is that, what we see there, the information that we get from that is that tech companies are doing really well, right? So the Dow Jones, big companies, the NASDAQ, tech companies. When we see the S&P 500, this basket of 500 companies consistently hitting new highs, then what we see is that the overall market, a wide swath of the market, is doing well. And that's why the S&P 500 closing above 5,000 for the first time ever in history is significant. And yes, it is true that inside of that is largely led by very large tech companies, particularly a group called the Magnificent Seven. So 7 very, very big tech companies in particular are definitely leading the pack. But when we see that the S&P 500 overall is rising and in fact is hitting a new high after new high after new high, what we know is that through the leadership of the Magnificent Seven, we're seeing the overall stock market rise, and we're seeing ourselves very, very firmly in bull market territory. So again, the significance of the S&P 500 crossing 5,000 for the first time ever and closing above 5,000 today is a signal that we are in firm bull market territory, and that all companies, all stocks, largely, speaking in the aggregate, are doing well as a result of this rally. Now, what does that mean in terms of interest rates? The next time that the Fed meets is going to be in March, and it looks more and more like they are not going to be lowering interest rates at the March meeting. So the meeting after that, which is going to be held April 30th and May 1st, is likely going to be the first time that they lower interest rates, if they even do so at that meeting. Time will tell. And it's at this point, right now it's early February. It's too early to say. In terms of other things that are in the economic news right now, we're seeing a lot of activity out of Saudi Arabia. We're seeing Saudi Arabia trying to diversify its economy and go heavily into sports. They're trying to have a bigger presence in the U.S. sports industry. That's been in the headlines quite a bit lately. We saw recently the interview with Vladimir Putin. And that's been in the news a lot lately. So we've got these headlines that are not economic headlines necessarily, but that are economic adjacent. Because what happens with the war between Russia and Ukraine, what happens with sports, or what happens on Sunday with the Super Bowl, like all of these things coalesce together to kind of to impact where our economy is going. And so we can't, as much as I like to hold to economic news specifically, of course, the economy by definition does not happen in a bubble. But there isn't at this moment anything particularly black swan or particularly market shaking that is moving us, at least not this week or next week, as far as we can see, moving us far off of what seems to be a pretty predictable course. And that predictable course being that businesses are spending, businesses are hiring, despite the high profile layoffs that we hear about in the headlines. We see overall that unemployment continues to be at a record low. We're actually nearing an almost 70-year low. We see overall that the rate of consumer spending has gone up, the rate of business spending has gone up, and we see overall just a positive trajectory in the markets. And there could always be shocks in oil prices. There could always be shocks in geopolitical events that might upset that. But as far as what we know based on the news of today, I'm recording this Friday, February 9th in the evening. There's really nothing major, nothing black swan that is pulling us too strongly off course. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about. One thing that I've been discussing with some people in this audience is, and in this community, do you remember back right after the pandemic, there was this thing in the headlines that was called the Great Resignation, right? Do you remember about 2 years ago? Or 3 years ago, everyone was talking about the Great Resignation, and that referred to the post-pandemic jobs shakeup that we had, where a lot of people started leaving their jobs, started taking breaks, taking sabbaticals from work, intentionally going, particularly knowledge workers were intentionally going for a brief period of time without any paid employment. And this happened quite a lot in 2021 when people discovered that because they could work remotely, the job market opened up for them. And now, if you were a knowledge worker, you could apply to jobs that weren't just in your specific local city or town, but you could apply to jobs nationwide, right? And so we had this thing called the Great Resignation, which was how the media dubbed this big this trend of people resigning from their jobs and then taking some time to look for their next job, and for that next job to be largely remote or hybrid. So we had that going on, and then we had the rise of what was called quiet quitting, right? And that was it started as a TikTok trend of people, predominantly Gen Z, who started sort of backing off of this mode of hyper productivity and hyper hustling, which was really popular pre-pandemic. And so it seems as though, it's funny to watch trends around the workplace, because in 2021 and 2022, we really saw a lot of Great Resignation, quiet quitting, and we don't hear much of that discussion anymore. Right now, what we hear about in the headlines are layoffs. And even though the data shows very, very strong employment, very, very low unemployment, we have stopped hearing, at least anecdotally, we've stopped hearing people really talk about quiet quitting, talk about the Great Resignation. What we see in the data more and more is that people are starting to worry about layoffs, despite the strong jobs news. If you go to glassdoor.com and they collect data on what people are searching for, more people are worried right now about the possibility of being laid off than they have been in the past several years. And so we're seeing this shift in attitudes towards work. Whereas a couple of years ago, people were like kind of over their jobs. Now we're seeing a shift in attitudes where people are more interested in their jobs, and specifically more interested in keeping their jobs. So I don't know what conclusions to draw from that per se, because the data, sometimes economic data and consumer sentiment or worker sentiment don't align with one another. But I do think that's a really interesting trend to watch, as you've seen this attitude towards work shift from where it was back in the days of the Great Resignation to where it is now in the days of Google searches and Glassdoor searches for what to do if you get laid off, really starting to tick up. So that's my social commentary of the week. All right. Well, thank you for being part of this. Every Friday, I come and just join and have a brief report on the biggest economic headlines of the week. And the big headline of this week was the S&P 500 crossing the 5,000 mark and closing above the 5,000 mark for the first time ever. Oh, and in the world of financial gossip, there's that meme lord, Liquidity. That meme lord was unfortunately unmasked by Business Insider. I'm kind of using the word unmasked in air quotes because he was just a guy who made harmless innocent memes, right? He never hurt anybody. He never trolled anybody. There was no reason to quote unquote unmask him because he never did anything wrong. But for some reason, Business Insider decided, for really, in my opinion, the sake of pure salaciousness, verging on doxing, they decided that they would reveal his identity. Now, if you haven't heard of Liquidity, this is one of the biggest financial meme accounts on the internet. So huge following on Instagram and Twitter. He decided, I'm not even going to say his name because he, wasn't the one who decided that that his name should be revealed to the public. But that's in terms of financial gossip. That's been sort of the big shakeup this week. He decided to get ahead of the story, and so he gave an interview to the Financial Times, where he wanted the Financial Times to be able to break the story first because if Business Insider was going to unmask him, all right, well, he could give the interview to the Financial Times, and then they could scoop it. So props to him for getting ahead of the story there. But it goes to show that nothing is sacred anymore and nothing is safe. And even something as innocent as making financial memes, if you get too popular, if you do it too well, despite the fact that you're not picking on anyone, you're not targeting any individuals, you're not doing anything that causes harm to anyone. There's no public good that gets served by revealing the identity of this person who makes memes. And yet Business Insider decided to do so. So it was a big disappointment to see that Business Insider made that decision. But I applaud him for getting ahead of the story and giving the interview to the Financial Times. And I applaud the Financial Times for making it their lead story. So yes, applause to, those in my view are the winners and losers of the world of finance this week. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for this joining me on this Friday night. And those are the headlines of the week. I hope you enjoyed that rundown. And I will catch you here live every Friday where I talk about what's happened this week. Thanks so much for tuning in, and see you next Friday.